Now I'll bet that no matter who you are, if you've played a strategy game on PC, you've probably played a Total War game. I mean, it is only one of the most successful strategy series, well, ever, in terms of really every available metric. But it didn't just come from anywhere. After creating sports games for EA for nearly a decade, Shogun Total War was Creative Assembly's first ever strategy game, envisioned as an easy opportunity to pull players from Command & Conquer. At the time, creating CNC clones was seen as a relatively simple and safe undertaking that was proving successful for others with games like Dark Reign and Crush, Kill and Destroy. But soon into its development, Shogun evolved past its initial conceptions and became its own beast. Thanks to the proliferation of fancy 3D accelerator cards in the late 90s, CA made an extremely bold call to shift the game fully to 3D, setting it apart from competitors of the day and priming it for success. They were clearly confident in what they had, because at the end of Shogun's development, their website said this: "We are also working on Shogun Total War, and like every other developer, we're intending to break the mold and produce an utterly stunning, genre-defining game. And unlike every other developer, it looks like we're going to succeed." And succeed they did. What was first thought of as a phoned-in knockoff to Command & Conquer became a genre-defining hit that set the stage for Creative Assembly's rise in the strategy genre, Total War's many future successes, and its enduring relevance to this day.
Who's laughing now?
But that's not to say the series hasn't had its issues. There have been numerous bumps in the road across its over 20-year history, with the past 5 years or so in particular being, well, interesting to say the least, with impassioned opinions on its trajectory being very easy to find with a quick search here on YouTube. And while this video is by no means meant to be a full-on evaluation on the state of Total War today, there will be a bit of time dedicated nearer to the end of this video for just that. But be warned, there might be a hot take or two. In 2011, 10 years since Shogun, Creative Assembly released Total War Shogun 2 to massive success. Arguably the first game to make the most of the upgraded engine first fielded with Empire in 2009, today Shogun 2 feels like the first of the new Total War games. It introduced a bunch of great mechanics and was fantastic to play. It managed to make robust melee combat out of an engine that had been focused on firearms, and it reinforced core Total War gameplay principles, emphasizing tactics and player choice. It was a great sandbox to play in, whether you were new to the series or a seasoned veteran. It was followed up by Fall of the Samurai, a standalone expansion that is my personal favourite entry in Total War, maybe just above Warhammer 2. And while it didn't change the fundamentals all that much, it did introduce tons of new toys to play with, as it expanded the sandbox even further, as well as turning the naval combat on its head, with its 19th century warships making for the best naval combat experience in the entire series, surpassing Napoleon. Shogun 2 and its expansion are commonly recommended today as one of the best options for players old and new to go back to. And thanks to it immediately preceding Rome 2, it's a game we'll be referencing a lot today. Following Shogun 2 and Fall of the Samurai would be no easy task, and for the first and still only time in the series' history, Creative Assembly decided to follow up a sequel with a sequel, this time going back to 2004's fan favourite Rome Total War. But unfortunately for everyone, the launch of Rome 2 would not be a positive affair, and it would take years to both repair the damage left from its release and get the game into the state that it's in now, where it sits as one of the most popular and expansive historical Total War games ever. But still, Rome 2 has its detractors. It's often cited as the game that began the slow decay of Total War's gameplay systems and tactics-based approach, instead relying more and more on stat modifiers, behind-the-scenes number crunching, gameplay simplifications, and the removal of established features. Either way, what no one knew at the time was that Rome 2 was setting the framework for the next decade of Total War, with its influence still being felt to this day. And depending on who you ask, that's either a great, good, or terrible thing. But as with any story, the best place to start is the beginning. So let's kick off this adventure with the game's disastrous launch as we cover and experience the full breadth of what this game is and what it has to offer in 2024. This is Total War Rome 2, 11 years later. These videos take a long time to make, so if you want to support me and what I do here, or if you just want to see more videos like this, then you can do so by becoming a patron or joining on YouTube memberships for as little as $1 a month. It helps me out massively and I hugely appreciate it. Total War has had and continues to have its share of questionable launches, but nothing has ever gone quite so awry as Rome 2 did. It was in an embarrassing state when it came out. Massive performance issues, bugs everywhere, erratic AI behavior, broken gameplay systems, plus a sleazy marketing campaign and day one on-disc DLC. It really did have it all. I played it briefly at the time, but I don't remember how bad it really was. So to find out, I actually installed the 1.0 version of the game, and yeah, it's really bad. I think I could live with the bugs, and maybe even the AI, but the performance is just shocking, even on a PC like mine, which is much stronger than those of the day. Every battle chugs like hell, and up close, it's just unbearable. It also looks pretty bad graphically, and even without any mods, it just doesn't look very good even compared to Shogun 2, which is an older game. I can see why the game was railed on so hard, this is atrocious. But thankfully, over the next couple of years, Rome 2 was smoothed out into something resembling a respectable video game. And rightly, it was only then that Creative Assembly began the very fleshed out, paid post-launch support window. Actually, I'm just kidding. They started selling DLC literally the day of the game's launch, with the Greek States Culture Pack being available for purchase if you didn't make the glorious decision to pre-order this masterpiece, in which case you got it for free. Now that is classy. A month after that, the $5 Blood DLC dropped, cringe. A few weeks later was another Culture Pack, and then in mid-December the first campaign pack dropped with Caesar and Gaul. Imagine if the game had been polished for those 3 months, up to the point where it was really ready for launch. Then all of that DLC could have been bundled together and been included for free, right? Right? 2014 saw a bunch of new content throughout the year for Rome 2, and then 2015 to 16 saw none at all, though the game still received some chunky patches and free updates. Finally, 2017 and 18 had the last pieces of DLC in 2 decently sized campaign packs, and the final faction pack with the Desert Kingdoms. With all that, Rome 2 had ended up in a pretty decent state, with quite a lot of free DLC, system overhauls, and patches to appease even those who weren't willing to pay for any extra content. And if you were, then there was certainly a lot to choose from, and a lot of stuff to sink your teeth into. A lot of people continued to enjoy Rome 2, and to this day it still sits proud in the top most played Total War games on Steam. It's clearly made an impact despite its horrible launch, and thanks to the years of support and DLC, it's now one of the most fleshed out games in the series, often cited as one of the best options to play whether you're experienced with Total War or just new to the series. And the community Rome 2 cultivated has undoubtedly paid off for it in the long run, because the number of guides and mods out there today is pretty big, ranging from simple visual uplifts to full rebuilds and conversions of the game. Whatever you're looking for, you can probably find it on the Steam Workshop. For this video, I played with a bunch of different configurations, including bone stock, but for reference, this is what I had landed on as my go-to for playing. I didn't want to stray too far from the core game, as at the end of the day, the goal of this video is to focus on that, but I did improve certain aspects of the game where I felt it would be beneficial. My full list is in the description if you're interested. Even though we're looking at a 10-year-old game here, Rome 2 is still quite the looker, thanks to all the updates it's received, especially with those few easily installed mods that I mentioned before. Even without them, it's not half bad today. Mods aside, I do think it lacks some of the artistic flair that made its predecessor so good, despite it being older and less intricate. Shogun 2 was great at readability, with its bright units and stylized elements, helping to give it serious longevity that continues to pay off today. Rome 2 has more of a realistic style, and while that made sense at the time, a decade on it feels stuck in the 2010s. It doesn't have that instant readability that Shogun 2 has, and even though it still looks pretty good at a technical level, I think in another 10 years, Rome 2 will seem a lot older than Shogun 2, which I think is always going to look pretty good. Kinda how like Age of Empires 2 will always look good, whether it's been 1, 10 or 100 years. I think Rome 2 would have done a lot better to adopt a more stylized neoclassicism look, as Shogun 2 had with its cohesive Edo period art style. Playing it today, things just feel mashed together, and from all over the place. You've got rendered characters in the family tree, stylized clay pot unit cards, differently styled technology icons, you get the idea. I might be making a mountain out of a molehill here, but it's just kinda jarring when you have things like this appear out of nowhere staring you in the face. I prefer this from Shogun 2 100% of the time. It's the same story on the battlefield, and I hate to keep comparing to Shogun 2, but it's hard not to. Get used to it for the rest of this video, by the way. But Rome 2 has a problem with readability. That, or Shogun 2 is just really good at it and it makes everything else look bad in comparison. There, I had no problem telling whose units were whose, but here I often don't have a clue. Once units have been dumped into their blobs, it's a sea of brown and grey, and if it weren't for the flags, I'd have no idea what's going on. It may not have been as realistic, but having team colours be so blindingly obvious in Shogun did wonders for being able to tell in a second how many guys you've got left and who's who in a fight. It's also a symptom of Rome 2 having so many more units. Unless you're incredibly knowledgeable and have remembered and learned every single type of them for every faction, some of whom feature unit cards like this, then you can forget about being able to tell what's what visually. At a macro level, battles themselves do still look impressive. Seeing thousands of men and women scrap it out still garners awe, especially on the more aesthetically pleasing maps like the coastal towns and cities. It holds up as you begin to scroll too. Units are pretty detailed, especially for a 10-year-old game, animations are solid, and the effects like arrow fire, blood, and artillery all look pretty decent. It's not until you get into the micro details that it starts to fall to bits a little. Total War has always been pretty good at showcasing massive amounts of units fighting each other, but it wasn't until Rome 2 that the blob started to become a real problem. This is what I mean, units pushing into each other, standing around, becoming a crush of epic proportions. It just looks bad. Units will still fight each other one-on-one, but you constantly see soldiers chilling out during battle, or just zipping around to engage their next opponent, or just exhibiting really strange behaviour. And squads of troops just don't tend to meld together as you'd expect them to in a melee. Now, at Rome 2's defense, it's not like this is exactly a new thing in Total War. I mean, even here in Medieval 2 it's not perfect by any means, but I think Shogun 2 just did it better. And it's hard not to be disappointed looking back at Rome 2, seeing its influence still be felt in games like Warhammer 3, where micro-level blob behaviour just really isn't that much better. At least there you have these massive units doing things like this that take your eyes off it.
Do you know what else started in Rome 2 that persists to this day? This design language. It's kind of impressive how this has stuck around over the years. It is astoundingly similar to what you see in Warhammer 3. It was only in Three Kingdoms where CA really diverged, and even then, there is a lot of history that could be traced back to Rome 2.
And that's a good thing, honestly, because the UI in Rome 2 is pretty darn good, even if the visual style isn't great. There are things I miss from Shogun 2, like how the movement range is displayed, but for the most part, it makes a lot of positive changes. Diplomacy in the campaign map is a great example. In Shogun 2 it looked good, and it was pretty immersive, but it was difficult to get an idea of who you were really looking at and get a broad overview of your relationships with other factions across the map.
It's much improved here, with the massive map making it super clear where everyone stands, not just diplomatically, but also physically, in terms of their placement to one another. It's also much easier to see things at a glance, with things like public order and food provisions being just a mouse hover away. Campaign map UI usability is a W for Rome 2, but the battle UI isn't so positive. It's not massively worse, but I do find myself preferring Shogun 2's layout and use of images for abilities, rather than these simple icons. On the layout front, it's a better use of space having things in the corners rather than trying to smush them into the middle, and the unit cards are just a bit of a mess. I wish they'd been able to find a way to squeeze effects and statuses as permanent elements, like in Shogun 2, rather than the cycling ones that are there now. It's tough to get an idea of what's happening at a glance, and it makes it harder to gauge how your troops are doing in the heat of battle. And no matter how many hours I play, I still need to take a sec to mouse over certain icons to remember what they do. The designs in Shogun 2 are much more legible, and frankly, they just look better.
Now, before we do get into the gameplay, let's briefly talk about the performance. Thankfully now, it's much improved. It's not perfect, but you could do a lot worse.
Back in 2013, you basically needed a supercomputer to run it at max settings, and even on low, it would bring a decent rig to its knees. AI turn timers grew to obscene lengths, and zooming into a battle of more than a few hundred units became a real slideshow. This was all part of the game's horrific launch state. Not only was it buggy, it was also horribly unoptimized, with the situation being made even more stark thanks to the relatively stable launch of Shogun 2 2 years before. That actually reflects the situation now, funnily enough, as Shogun 2 is an absolute joy to run, while Rome 2 still struggles comparatively with high density battles and late game turn timers. But thanks to a decade of patches, expansions, and, well, new hardware, it's more than tolerable today. You'll really run into any significant bugs, and unless you're running the game on a PC from that era, you shouldn't have any big game affecting complaints. After 5 years and 6 campaign packs, there are a lot of campaigns to play, ranging across a 700-year history between 432 BC and 275 AD. As a new or less experienced player, there's no reason to get caught up with which campaign you should be playing, or that you're missing out by not owning any of the DLC. With exception to the Empire Divided campaign, the fundamentals are almost 100% the same across all of them. The only thing you might want to consider is a more focused experience, in which case Wrath of Sparta and Caesar and Gaul do provide a game with a smaller map, fewer factions, and less stress overall. But again, I wouldn't worry if you're new. Just play the Grand Campaign and restart as a new faction when you're 50 turns in, like everyone else. Once you've done that a few times, you should know enough to decide for yourself if any of the campaign DLC is going to be worth playing. The Grand Campaign is the one that launched with the game, and as factions have been added and patches delivered, it's expanded over time in terms of playability. The map is large, and completing a full game will take you a while. Even without owning any DLC, there are a ton of factions to choose from that give very solid variety in their starting difficulty, playstyles, and locations. I think Rome 2's Grand Campaign is one of the more sandboxy feeling ones of recent memory, besides maybe Immortal Empires. You can easily forget about the objectives and just play your way through the countryside until you get bored. Caesar and Gaul was the first campaign DLC that launched in December 2013 alongside Patch 8, just 3 months after the initial release. Personally, this is actually my favourite campaign of the bunch because of its smaller scale and focused objectives, with only 18 provinces on the map. I could be biased because this is a campaign that I actually have a chance of hell in beating without wanting to start a new one. At the time of its launch, Caesar and Gaul was more significant because of its addition of in-game seasons, a feature that was bafflingly missing from the Grand Campaign until the next big update in 2014. The justification at the time being that a standard turn in the Grand Campaign was 1 year of in-game time, so seasons weren't needed. It was always summer. Whereas in Caesar and Gaul, each turn was 2 weeks of in-game time, meaning seasons had a significant impact on gameplay elements like troop movements and food production. What's funny though is that the turns in the Grand Campaign are still now 1 year of in-game time, meaning the world of Rome 2 takes place in some kind of Game of Thrones tier hellscape where winter lasts for a year and only occurs once every 4 years. I do recommend the 4 turns per year mod to somewhat alleviate this problem. Hannibal at the Gates followed 3 months later alongside the previously mentioned Seasons and Wonders update in early 2014. Like Caesar and Gaul, it was also more focused than the Grand Campaign, with a much smaller map of 19 provinces and interesting starting situations where the main 2 factions, Rome and Carthage, featured many allies and diplomatic agreements from the get-go. Despite what the name of the DLC suggests, Hannibal will only really be at the Gates if you play him yourself, though the guaranteed major faction Empires mod can help with this. Still, it's a good campaign set during a historically important time period, and if you're familiar with the history, then playing as the big man carving through Romans is pretty sweet. Imperator Augustus came later in 2014 as a free campaign to all players and saw a return to larger campaigns following the previous 2 DLCs. It features 4 separate Roman factions as part of the 10 total playable options, and it's a great alternative to the Grand Campaign if you prefer the setting. This was actually the first Rome 2 campaign I ever played, and therefore I have a certain affinity for it. It's not based on any kind of facts or logic. If I had to guess, I'd say it's the fragmented Roman factions that make it interesting to me, despite not knowing a lot of the history behind it. It's fun to try bring them together, playing as one of them, or just crush them completely, both pretty good options. Wrath of Sparta came at the end of 2014, and it's likely the biggest departure from base Rome 2 in terms of its campaign, definitely at the time. Until the recently released Total War Pharaoh, it was the earliest historical setting Total War had ever showcased, taking part in 432 BC during the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. There are only 4 playable factions in this one, and the map is about average in size compared to the other campaigns with 22 provinces. The layout is quite interesting though, and it makes for some unique overworld gameplay thanks to the single land bridge connecting the 2 halves of the map. Because of the time period, the unit rosters are also quite unique for all of the factions, featuring quite a few differences from their standard Rome 2 counterparts. And while they're smaller in scope, I actually prefer this to the regular factions that are more fluffed up, with multiple units that feel superfluous. After Wrath of Sparta, it took 3 years for the next campaign to drop, with Empire Divided, and this was a bit of a shake-up for a few reasons. First off, it was developed by a completely different studio, Creative Assembly Sofia. Despite the CA name, Sofia was a studio with a lot of unique history. Founded in 2001 as Black Sea Studios, they made a name for themselves developing their own RTS games throughout the 2000s, until they were brought out by Crytek in 2008, during their expansion riding on the success of Far Cry and Crysis. Long story short, Crytek were cutting their losses in the late 2010s, and Creative Assembly bought the studio in 2017, thus renaming them to Creative Assembly Sofia. Their first project was this DLC for Rome 2, and they'd go on to create more Total War projects, namely Troy and Pharaoh. Sadly, it's safe to say that their future is likely in turmoil right now, following those games' mixed receptions, difficult launches, and Creative Assembly's overall shake-up right now. Anyway though, back to 2017, Empire Divided is interesting because frankly this should probably be a DLC for Total War Attila. It's set much closer to that than anything in Rome 2, and Attila was the newer game. My guess is that CA rightly thought that it would sell more as a DLC for Rome 2, so here we are. But despite it being a Rome 2 DLC, Empire Divided wasn't afraid to make some quite noticeable changes in both gameplay and presentation. It introduced new city mechanics around cleanliness and bandit activity, and addressed one of many people's primary complaints with Rome 2's art, because it replaced the unit cards with completely new ones. Personally, I don't think this is actually that big of a W. The original issue wasn't that they didn't look good, it was the clarity. It was just hard to tell what was what. And I don't think that's much improved here. Maybe it's a little better, but then you make the trade-off of having them look kind of worse, cheap even? I don't know, maybe there's just no winning with me. Personally, I think Shogun 2's great, and Warhammer figured it out, so I'm sure they could have done something here. Whatever, Empire Divided is a pretty big campaign with 10 playable factions and a large map. It also came alongside a free update that overhauled the political system from the base game and all previously released campaigns. A final thing to note, this patch and DLC was the point where the Mac and PC versions of the game split, with the Mac release not receiving this or any future updates. Pretty disappointing for the few Mac players out there, though probably not as disappointing as Apple dropping support for 32-bit programs on their newer OSs a few years later. meaning the game will no longer work at all on Macs running Big Sur or newer. I believe this is still the case, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I doubt Apple or Creative Assembly are willing to put in the work to fix this, especially now, so this will almost certainly never be resolved, which sucks. Our last campaign, Rise of the Republic, was also developed by Creative Assembly Sophia, their last project before moving on to Troy. It was released a year after Empire Divided, and takes us way back to 399 BC, during the foundational period of the Roman Republic. So at least this makes sense to be a DLC to Rome 2, rather than Attila. Like the previous DLC, it came alongside a chunky patch known as the Ancestral Update, which added the family tree system as well as updating and fixing many other things across the game. The map in the DLC is large and detailed, and there's great variety between the factions' starting situations and pathways, with Rome in particular being very difficult to start compared to the rest, which is fair considering the history. That's quite a few campaigns, and if you want to buy them all, on sale, then there's a ton of content to play if you're into it, or you're making a 1 or 2 hour YouTube video about them. To both the game's detriment and benefit though, there's not a single one that stands out above the rest, or offers something drastically different. If you hate the core of Rome 2 and the Grand Campaign, none of the DLC campaigns will change your mind. But on the other hand, if you love the base game, then there's no reason you won't enjoy any of them either. If you're wondering which to play after the Grand Campaign, I'd say simply pick the time period that interests you the most, and go for your life. With all the DLC, Rome 2 includes nearly 80 total playable factions, which is crazy. Though remember, there are quite a few double ups here, thanks to how the campaigns work. Like there are multiple versions of Rome, for example, as they're slightly different in each campaign. The Grand Campaign includes 36 total playable factions, so whatever way you slice it, there's a lot to choose from. For the number of cultures there are, there's probably less variety than you think. They all share a lot of common elements, and they only differ in their unit rosters and a few unique campaign mechanics. This is one of Rome 2's biggest weak points. Because of how many options there are, they all just begin to blend together and it becomes a bit of a mess. More options feel like fewer real choices in this case because your picks don't feel very impactful. The game's going to play pretty much the same either way, and the visuals aren't all that distinct either. In Shogun 2, there are a lot of common elements, but because of the overall fewer factions and much fewer units, their differences have more of a stark effect next to one another. And in Warhammer, the visuals and presentation styles pick up the slack that their ultimately minor mechanical differences can't. One of the main reasons I prefer the smaller campaigns is the more limited options in factions and units. Because Rome 2 only feels vast until you start looking closer at the actual differences between those units.
Rome certainly does have a lot of spear infantry. I sure hope that they're diversified with unique stats and abilities that give me actual reasons to use them over one another, aside from their unit cost.
Once you've picked your culture and faction, you're dropped into a campaign map that's seen many drastic changes compared to its direct predecessor in Shogun 2. And while it wasn't obvious at the time, it actually debuted the framework that all Total War games would continue to use even up to today with its newest entries over 10 years later. The core tenets of the overworld are as they've always been though. You're managing your civilization and all of its aspects, but at more of a macro level than a contemporary 4X or city building game. There are populations to keep happy, cities to develop, and armies to lead, while at the same time moving your technological and diplomatic ambitions forward towards an ultimate goal determined by the campaign you're playing. For simplicity's sake, let's assume a victory condition of controlling a certain number of the map's provinces. Nice and easy. And there in itself lies the first big change. In previous Total War games, each province was its own section of the map which contained a town that could be upgraded and developed upon. Using Shogun 2 as an example, you can see that in each province we get the same freedoms to develop it into the kind of identity that we want to. It could be focused on military, resources, technology, whatever. Contrary to previous games, a province is now made up of several towns, along with a primary city that has more build slots, with the rest having a smaller number. This changes the overall gameplay quite significantly. It's not inherently worse, but it has led to gameplay decisions that I don't think benefit the experience. Provincial capitals and their surrounding towns do function similarly to provinces from earlier games. Public order is still measured on a per province basis, not per settlement, so you can imagine a province as a kind of a big unit, that works together rather than truly separate locations.
Once you control all the settlements inside a province, you could set a provincial edict, which act sort of like a bonus for your local conquest. You can do things like boost food production, increase public order, increase the tax rate. You get the idea. It's all positives.
In a way, the small towns replaced the on-map locations from Shogun 2, which reflected the buildings you build in your settlement. And this represents one of the main downsides of this new system, and the beginning of an overarching trend of simplification, where gameplay elements are reduced to stat modifiers and on-screen buttons, rather than proper tactics that you physically implement on your own. As an example, in Shogun 2, if you wanted to raid a hostile province, you took an army, and you attacked one of their provincial buildings, as a lot of those buildings are physically represented on the game map. You could raid a port to cripple trade, attack farms to hurt food production, you get the idea. Each of these then required the owning faction to pay to repair the damage, therefore putting a financial burden on their economy, and you still had your big army for them to deal with. In Rome 2, raiding has been rolled into a new mechanic called stances, where standing armies can employ said stance depending on what you want them to do. In this case, if you want to raid, you take an army into hostile territory, as little as 1 pixel into their land, then you set your stance to raiding. That will then immediately bring in a set amount of income, and reduce the army's upkeep during the raid. This is all well and good in a vacuum, but you can see how this is a significant change and simplification of a previous mechanic. There's no thought required to how deep into hostile territory you want to venture to maybe hit a more impactful target, or even what target you want to hit at all. Other stances are like this too. Ambushing has been reduced to a button that you can use anywhere, whereas before you had to make the choice to physically hide your army in dense forest to get the jump on the enemy. This leads into another big change, and a contentious one at that, because Rome 2 is the game that introduced the requirement of needing a general to lead an army at all times, a mechanic that persists to this day. Many people were and are still not pleased with this, as it removes a lot of player agency in managing your military, especially because there are also limits on the number of armies you can field at any one time, depending on how far your civilization has progressed through the campaign. This removes certain options that were previously available, like permanently stationing extra troops in certain cities to bolster its defences, or sending small strike groups to scout, fight off rebels, raid, or just do anything that didn't require a full stack of units. Now of course you can still have small armies to fulfill this role, but you're limited to the number of armies you can field as is, and that limit is pretty low. And you're going to need every one of those slots to expand and defend your civilization, especially in the mid to late game, where your frontier is expanding further and further. It also lessens the likelihood of smaller armies clashing with each other, which was something I always enjoyed in earlier games, as you're encouraged to use full army complements of 20 units when possible, because doing anything else is simply a detriment to your progress. There are other flow-on effects that are particularly annoying. Not having any options to resist an enemy force, besides whatever garrison you have, leads to an irritating trading of towns in the early game as you bring an army over, take it back under your control, just to lose it again in a few turns because you had to move those troops elsewhere. And as an aside, towns cannot be fortified like provincial capitals can, and they have fewer build slots to garrison a larger force, which exacerbates this problem. In past games, I could leave an auxiliary force in the area without a general to float about and deploy when needed. It was at the cost of my economy having to support those extra troops that may just be sitting around, but hey, that's my choice. And that's the kind of agency that we've lost here, and it continues to be lost in every Total War game since. However, this also means that in the mid to late game, you can have permanent, large garrisons in provincial capitals by building lots of military structures, and have them there essentially for free with no upkeep. And while it probably isn't enough to hold back a big army on its own, it can certainly reinforce a defending one to provide a massive defender's advantage, much more than you'd find in previous games. Because not only does that garrison protect your city, it can also sally out and fortify any friendly army in a generous vicinity, and it fully regenerates in strength instantly after any battle, and it can't be permanently killed unless the city is lost, and immediately appears upon capturing a settlement and waiting just one turn. For the uninitiated, it may sound like this makes my previous complaint about not being able to bolster your cities with your own garrison redundant, but it doesn't. Before, you had the choice. If you wanted to station high-end units in a city, you could. It would drain your economy, but you could choose. It's completely different to the garrisons in Rome 2, which are free infinite, and unable to be controlled or customized. They provide a huge defender's advantages with none of the downsides of stationing a large garrison yourself, and it removes a key piece of player agency in how you want to defend your settlements. Armies are trained differently too thanks to this requiring of generals to lead them. No longer can you recruit units directly from settlements, instead you now raise an army with a particular leader and recruit units directly into that army from what's available in the province where they currently reside, or by paying exorbitant fees to mercenary hires that recruit instantly. No longer is it a logistical burden to get units from the homeland to the frontier. You simply enter into a province where you have a military building, wait a turn or three, and bam, you got a stack of units. Or just make a mockery of the system by using your massive mid-game wealth to field an army of mercenaries for one turn to fight off any enemy, then immediately disband them that same turn once the threat is dealt with. The artificial cap placed on numbers of armies and navies you can field really sucks. I think it's a huge mark against the game, and I'm disappointed that it's something we still see in Total War. For one, it just doesn't make any sense. I can have 40 units split across 2 armies of 20 each, but not 30 units split into 3 armies of 10 units each. Why? Would making one more group of units immediately cause the men to all die instantly? Or is it a gamified mechanic meant to handhold players to not overextend themselves in the early game, or because it would be too complicated? Imagine if Supreme Commander didn't allow you to stall your economy because it was too complicated, or Dark Souls didn't let you go to certain areas if you were a certain level because it'd be too hard. The best games let us make mistakes so we can learn and get better from them, not place artificial limitations to never allow those mistakes to begin with. And because of the requirements to need a general to lead every army, generals themselves have now become very disposable for both you and your enemy. Assassinating an enemy general in Shogun 2 used to be a significant win, leaving the army leaderless and open to attrition and attack from your forces. Now they're immediately replaced from an infinite pool of military leaders, so why ever bother? Diplomacy also saw quite a few changes in Rome 2 that persist to this day. Some are okay, it's good even, but lots are objective downgrades, and overall behaviour across the board is just simply bizarre. You can sign a variety of agreements with opposing factions, ranging from military alliances to simple peace treaties, the success of which is supposedly determined by how much they tolerate you as a faction and the benefits that said agreement would have for them. I say supposedly because a lot of the time they'll simply deny your requests for no clear reason. It would obviously benefit them, a much smaller faction, to have a defensive alliance with me, a faction they're very friendly with, but nope, denied because fuck you. They'll do things like declare war and then immediately sue for peace the turn after and go back to being friendly, or attack an ally of mine knowing I'd get pulled into the war, then again just sign a peace treaty right after. Mechanically, the system has seen simplification too. Military access has been reduced to an indefinite bilateral agreement, whereas before it could be unilateral for a set number of turns. Plus there's been a removal of options like hostage trading and trade embargoes. There are other little things that annoy me too, like how if an ally is attacked you can't move around the map to get information on who's attacking them apart from their faction's name, meaning you better remember who's who and what their power level is, so you can decide whether it's worth maintaining this alliance to get drawn into another war. Contrary to how it sounds, there are some positives though. Overall, the UI is much improved and it's a lot easier to navigate. Being able to look around the map and get a super clear indication of factions' opinions on one another is really useful, as are the really obvious icons for treaties and such. Because of how it's designed and laid out, I also find it much simpler to do what I need to do and do it fast. And I'm glad this UI for the most part has stuck around in this form, because despite the issues I have with it mechanically, it is very well designed. One aspect that wasn't great on launch but has been turned around since then is the family tree and politics mechanics, which are much more fleshed out than the honestly laughable state they were in on launch. From here, you can get an easy to understand overview of your civilization, including your stats around provinces and income, your political standing, and how far through your size progression you are. Then you've got the characters tab, which shows important characters in your regime like family members, generals and diplomats, from both your ruling party and any others that make up your government. From here you can do a bunch of things, like send characters on civil missions to improve diplomatic relations with other factions, assist specific provinces with food production, arrange a marriage, send gifts to political parties, and lots more. I think the system is pretty decent, and it's a solid way of adding some depth to the game that doesn't involve armies or city management. You get the feeling like you're administering a real culture of actual people, and pulling off some light civil and diplomatic coups makes me certain that the next fantasy Total War will be Game of Thrones, and it will feature systems built around this kind of thing. Lastly here, you've got your politics tab, which shows active political parties and allows you to either purge them or secure their loyalty if you so desire. At a cost, of course. However, mismanaging your political system can lead to a secession, a particularly frustrating mechanic in certain campaigns that occurs when a political party gets a little too big for their britches. Secessions can happen multiple times throughout a campaign, and when they do, your secessionist faction will immediately take a chunk of your settlements, as well as your armies, no matter if they're near those settlements or not. This leads to a ton of backpedaling as you go back into your own lands to re-secure lost territory, as well as the fact that you now have at least a couple of your army stacks ready to cause trouble against you and yours in places where you likely don't have any forces because they just took the only army in the vicinity. It's a fine idea in theory, but in practice it's just painful. There's no way to find a diplomatic solution or have any impact on what territories or armies are taken, and in the end, it just makes me want to Alt F4 and start a new campaign, because all my goals have just been put on hold, and I just cannot be bothered to put all of these fires out just to reclaim a position that I just had before.
One of the biggest things holding the campaign map back in Rome 2 is its insistence on forcing gameplay systems on you. The overworld is just far more rigid than it used to be, and it makes every campaign, at least for me, feel a lot more like the last. That's to say, it's getting repetitive.
It's mainly because of the Imperium system that CA stubbornly refuses to let go of. I mean, if that's the gameplay they want, then sure, it's their game, I guess. But I can still complain about it. The army limits are frustrating and they just don't make any sense. I don't like being forced into these arbitrary boxes just because a number says so. The game should give me the tools to give me room to think about my decisions and utilize open-ended mechanics to win. It'd be much more replayable as a result, and the skill ceiling would be significantly higher. It would be better, straight up, and I'm disappointed that these systems are still carried forward today, because I would have loved to have played a Total Warhammer game with the mechanics of older Total Wars. Alright, but let's roll it back to the armies here. Since each army has a general, they're more prominent throughout the campaign, and while, as discussed, I don't think they should be a requirement for every army, I do like what was done to them to make them feel like a significant part of them. Each has skill trees that can affect the army or province that they're currently in, their combat prowess, and a range of other things. When fielded, you also get to choose which kind of unit they're a part of, which I love. This could be, say, a unit of heavy spears, or elephants, or cavalry even. It depends on your faction of course, but this is a great addition, and it works the same for navies too. This means you can really tailor a general to be good at a specific thing, like leading the army from behind, or physically fighting in it at the front, whereas in Shogun 2 I always felt like my generals were a bit more fragile, and I was reluctant to get them into the fight unless I was very confident in the outcome. Army movement is generally unchanged except for one key aspect: water. In previous games you required a navy to transport land troops across water, but now troops can move themselves over water without a friendly fleet. This is great in terms of mobility, but it gets annoying quick once an enemy faction starts ocean invasions out of nowhere, when it's a lot harder to screen because of the infinitely high number of ingress points. When you do engage those fleets, auto-resolve will prove to be a very strange beast. It ranges from quite representative to how the battle will play out, to completely bonkers, and I still struggle to understand how it actually works. When you're back on land, it seems to be kind of mostly about right. It considers troop numbers and compositions, but on the ocean it is just everywhere, it's all over the place. And yeah, we'll get into that a bit more in depth later. They implemented a new system that lets you choose an army stance for the auto-resolve, and those results are always pretty accurate. Even if the decision making is simple, you just choose the result that gives the highest surviving troops percentage, and then you're good to go. Your campaign difficulty does have an impact on these scenarios too, so auto-resolve will be more favourable on lower settings. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not the best tactician when it comes to the real-time battles, so I do lean on auto-resolve here and there, though certainly not as much as I play more and more. I win the odd unfavourable battle here and there, and I feel like those are becoming more frequent, which is always great to see, and it's very satisfying to pull off. In saying that, choosing your campaign difficulty is very important though, and it will impact your enjoyment significantly depending on the kind of player that you are. The game doesn't make it clear what changing the difficulty actually does, nor does it give the option of setting difficulty independently for the overworld campaign and the real-time battles, which they did add in later Total Wars. But actually you can do it in Rome, but you have to change it after you've started a campaign through the game menu, which is just weird. I don't know why it's not available at the start. Regardless, you've got the choice between easy, normal, hard, very hard, and legendary. As the difficulty increases in the overworld, you'll find diplomacy with AI being more challenging, and they'll be more aggressive in their expansion towards you. Basically, they're less of a pushover in the medium difficulties, and at the higher end of the scale, they're ruthless. Legendary also adds an Iron Man requirement, meaning you can't manually save your game, making every decision permanent. I do wish this option was able to be added manually to other difficulties, because while I really like Iron Man modes, I do find very hard/legendary to be a bit overtuned. Don't get me wrong, it's great it's there for capital G Total War gamers, but one of them I am not. This applies doubly to the real-time battle difficulty, which I actively don't like on higher levels. What I mean is that I could handle the overworld on legendary, but I do not enjoy the real-time battles at that level because of what the difficulty setting does to the gameplay. We'll get into the details later, but for now, I reckon hard is the sweet spot. It still provides a challenge, but it doesn't feel like the game is constantly beating on you with artificial difficulty.
And on that note, I think we've waited long enough. We're over a dozen pages into this script at this point, so I think it's time to talk about the real-time battles.
Despite always being a two-mode affair, the real-time battles have always been Total War's true focus. The general gameplay is, at its core, very similar to the last few games, but its massive roster of both unit and unit types makes it stand apart from its predecessors. Across all the factions, you've got a bunch of unit types that represent that period. Multiple types of hand-to-hand, in-your-face infantry, big units of pikemen, ranged bows, slings, javelins, horse archers, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, artillery pieces, elephants, the whole buffet, really.
The overarching unit types push combat into a sort of complicated rock, paper, scissors style of gameplay. Spears beat cavalry, infantry beat spears, and archers beat infantry. You've heard it before. But it's a lot more complicated in Rome 2.
Total War's combat has always differentiated itself by making those engagements more involved, thanks to unit morale, rewards for smart maneuvering, and other statuses and rules of engagement that make it more than your simple spear beat horse.
That may be true in an overall sense, but if horse attacks spear from the rear and engage them on their terms, well, maybe horse beats spear.
Since their inception, the draw of the real-time battles has been its tactical sandbox. That might have changed in the last while thanks to Warhammer, instead perhaps providing more of a spectacle showcase rather than an intricately detailed battle arena. But actually, wait a minute, I meant to say that actually began here in Rome 2, as it started a trend of relying more on stat modifiers and behind-the-scenes number crunching rather than actual tactical decisions. Suddenly, it was less about did I position my units correctly, and more did I remember to press the button that gives my units a damage buff for a set period. This is a complex conversation, and frankly, I don't know enough on the subject to completely tear it down and dissect it. But if someone like me can notice and be affected by it, then a lot of you will be able to tell as well. The most obvious way it stands out is in comparison to Shogun 2. The wedge formation is a commonly cited example for good reason. It encapsulates the main differences very well. For those unaware, in Shogun 2 the flying wedge formation for select cavalry units is purely a formation change. No stats are altered and no bonuses are given. The wedge isn't strictly better, but it is a tool that you can use to break enemy lines and utilise tactically. The wedge ability in Rome 2, however, is a stat change. Formation has no real bearing on the ability's effect. As you can see, the stats go up after pushing the button, whether the unit is in formation or not. And that's what abilities like this are being reduced to. Numbers is not about strategy or tactics, it's about can you press the button in time. It's damaging the sandbox and lessening the impact smart decision making has on the game. And wasn't that the whole point of Total War to begin with? I don't want to make it seem like this ruins the game completely. You can still have a lot of fun with the battles, as I still do, despite my criticisms of the mechanics. But it's hard not to be disappointed with it when Shogun 2 was just so much better. As were the earlier games like Rome 1 and Medieval 2, though I don't have as much experience with those as I do the newer games. But something all games in the series have struggled with to varying degrees is the blob, caused when hundreds or thousands of units get caught up in a melee and become, well, a big blob. Shogun 2 handled it pretty well, but in Rome 2 it's brutal. In larger battles in particular, the blob is a menace, showing its face frequently in sieges and more often than I'd like in a pitched battle. I think it's more noticeable here because of how morale works. For whatever reason, it's just harder to break units and rout them in combat, even when it feels like they should be melting thanks to your superior tactical genius. Again, back in Shogun 2, if you got a unit of cavalry caught up in a melee with spearmen, they're toast. They'll be routing in as much time it takes you to realise what's going on. But here it's nothing like that. A unit will rout eventually, yeah, but look how long it takes for this unit of cavalry to break. I'm attacking from the front and rear with spears and they're just shrugging it off, fighting away for ages. It's the same with this fight. Despite the middle unit being much stronger and higher tier, it's completely surrounded by 3 units with vastly superior manpower. I don't care if you're Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, if you're being attacked on all sides and aren't in any kind of formation, you're fucked. This should be a swift defeat by a weaker force against a stronger enemy by using superior tactics to encircle and cut them down. But nope, they never break and end up causing the enemy to rout instead. Battles can also become even more frustrating because of that difficulty setting we talked about. Above normal, the AI actually receives buffs to their stats, not just their computer-controlled intelligence. So the same unit will straight up perform better against yours in a fair fight on higher difficulties. I really don't like this kind of difficulty because it just feels unfair. I think hard is the sweet spot. There is a little buff, but it's not enough to make it feel unbalanced, it's just a challenge. All in all, Rome 2 just has some of my least favourite battles in the whole series, thanks to fewer meaningful tactical options, the prevalence of unit blobbing, and how the morale works. It's the least rewarding, and frankly, it's not that good to watch either, outside of a few circumstances. You can still have fun with it, as I do sometimes, but the more you think and the more you try and really engage with it, the more you'll just become frustrated. Yes, there are times where I was able to use a weaker force to beat a stronger enemy, but they were fleeting, and more often than not, it only went in my favour because the AI made some brain-dead positioning decision, or split their force in half for no reason. Most of the time, it's a numbers game. Whichever side feels the most power will win. Tactics be damned. And yeah, maybe I'm just bad. I can accept that. But I can do it in Shogun 2, so why can't I do it here? Unfortunately, the story continues for the ship combat, which is a massive disappointment. Naval combat was probably the best thing to come out of Empire, and I think we can all agree it peaked in Fall of the Samurai. Hell, I still go back and play a variety of naval battles for fun here and there to this day. So it pains me to say that unfortunately in Rome 2, it's pretty average. I would even say it kinda sucks. While you still have a variety of ships to utilise, more in fact here thanks to being able to field melee, ranged, and artillery vessels of varying sizes and flavours, the options you have for controlling them and engaging in combat are far more limited. Melee ships are a straight shot. You slam them into the enemy vessel and you board them until you wipe out the troops. Ranged vessels require a bit more thought I guess, but the goal is the same. You just pepper them with arrows until you kill everyone on board, or maybe you're able to set fire to the ships with flaming shots. And artillery is the same. They're ranged, except instead of firing 100 shots, you just fire 1. Anyway, that all sounds good, but there's just no nuance to it. There are no unique ways of controlling your ships, no speed options except for forward and fast forward for 10 seconds. You can't affect ship mobility or locomotion by taking out oarsmen or flooding them. Unit numbers only affect combat prowess, that's to say a ship with one deck combatant will still move and tack at full speed, and you can only have one unit type on a ship. There's no option for 50-50 splits where half are melee for boarding and fighting or repelling boarding, and the other half are, say, ranged units with arrows or something. And lastly, there's no kind of weather or chop in the ocean that affects gameplay all that much. It'd be great if there were some options for really rough seas that made boarding and ramming a nightmare, but there's not. Ships are just big dumb objects, you just point them at each other and you let it rip. Naval battles can be a bit of simple fun, particularly if you're new to the game, but they fall apart when you realise how completely bonkers ramming is. You see, ships have their own health, irrelevant of how many men are alive on deck, and ships in the game can be completely obliterated with just a few direct hits from another ship when they ram it, with lesser ones even requiring only 1 or 2 shots. Now, remember how I said ship speed isn't affected by how many troops are alive? You might be able to see where I'm going with this. When you realise all of what I just mentioned, you can massively exploit naval battles by swarming enemy fleets with smaller vessels, and as long as you have more ships than them, you're almost certainly going to come out on top by ramming the hell out of them. This means you can do this repeatedly with a single fleet, and even though hundreds of men will die, its proficiency never falls because you have the superior number of vessels and they're always got the same speed. When you can have an auto-resolve scenario look like this, and then have the outcome look like this, something is clearly wrong. Like, a lot of these ships have single-digit crews, yet they detonate enemies as good as any other. Hilarious. There is one more battlefield for ships though, and that's the Combined Arms Coastal Assaults. This is a pretty cool idea honestly, and it's a bit of a saving grace for the naval battles. You can have troops land on the beach while your navy covers them, deploy the troops from said navy to assist in the ground invasion, or simply have both armies fight it out independently. It's impressive to look at and it's a fun change of pace. The sieges in particular present some unique challenges, having to land units at specific locations rather than being able to attack from any angle in a traditional ground siege. Unless you have an army supporting from land, of course, then you can do both. That allows the enemy to set up choke points and defensive lines quite effectively as they try and push you back into the sea, so you're encouraged to try and think of smarter ways to go about it rather than just blob all your units on the shore. There's also the element of the ships being able to provide cover fire to your landing troops, if you've got the range for it, which is both satisfying and great to look at as those big floating artillery pieces get to work. Like most things in Rome though, beach landings can be irritating at times. Units can't be controlled until every man has jumped onto the beach, which is painfully slow, so you often find yourself just getting pelted by enemy missile units for ages until you can actually respond. Units can't reboard ships in any way, even if they originated from a military vessel rather than a transport. They just get off and the ship just leaves, which is unfortunate because I could have used that as a battering ram. I mean, really it does fit the theme of the game, good to look at times, but with not a lot of player agency or sandbox elements. Once your troops are off the boats, it's just a regular battle. There's not a lot you can do differently once you deploy your boots on the ground.
Speaking of sieges, look, they're pretty average. We all know it. For a long time now, sieges have been a sore spot in Total War.
Their simplicity in Shogun 2 made them inoffensive, but here in Rome 2 they can be quite a slog, especially on the larger maps, and therefore they are harder to love. The small town sieges are fine, I guess. I've got nothing really against them. The lack of walls makes them not too different to a regular battle, except that there's a capture point and some added buildings that can affect how troops move, and occasionally they make for some pretty interesting choke points. City sieges are similar, except you've got to go through the walls, which as the attacker gets annoying because more often than not you're trying to force a large number of units through a small hole, or maybe two, leading to more unit blobbing and fewer tactical options. It's also where the game performance is at its worst by far. I will say though, the one aspect of sieges I do like in Rome 2 are those combined coastal battles, like I said. There are just more options with how you approach the attack, and it's far more enjoyable, such as when you attack from both sides and force the enemy to split their troops, so they need to deal with both your land force and your landing ships in the harbour that might be able to bypass their walls entirely. Regular old skirmishes are a simple affair, and they're a good way to try out new strategies, set unusual matchups, or simply give a bunch of different units a go to see how you find them. You can play with any faction you own, however they're limited to fighting against factions from the campaigns that they're playable in. So, for example, you can't fight the Spartans from the Wrath of Sparta DLC against the Spartans from the Grand Campaign. They can only go up against other factions from the same expansion. Setting up a skirmish game makes painfully obvious the lack of any real unit variety in comparison to how many units are actually available. In the campaign, it's not so obvious because you're developing towns, you're moving through your tech tree, and you're not getting a full view of every unit available at every one time, at least not until the later game. But here, you can see how much copy-pasting is going on without any real differentiation. Look at all these Roman units, for example. Simple stat increases that have no meaningful difference to one another. It's a bloated roster that feels unnecessary. At least in Warhammer the units are visually distinct with some excellent flavour. Here, you'd struggle telling a lot of these units apart on the battlefield, let alone off it. My issue with all these units is that there's no reason to use a lot of them. In Shogun 2 there were great reasons to use basically every unit, as despite there being fewer of them, each filled a unique role and had a tangible difference. Such was the case with the Yari Ashigaru and the Yari Samurai. The former were much cheaper, but they provided an exceptional defensive wall against oncoming cavalry and infantry, whereas the latter were exceptional at closing the distance to other units with their rapid advance ability, while still providing a solid defensive unit, albeit at a much higher cost with a smaller unit size. Rome 2 is just quantity over quality, and while some people may prefer that, I'd rather have units I can actually remember that have meaningful gameplay differences between them. Some other things I would have liked to see in Skirmish is the ability to field armies without generals, just so I could test them against each other properly, plus the ability to have more than 2 teams on a map and have more granular control over the starting team and unit placement to set up specific scenarios with me against the AI. Overall, Skirmish is simple. It's a good way to get a practice in, or get used to a particular game type, or try a faction out. But unfortunately, it does shine some light on Rome 2's worst battle features, namely its unit variety and overall faction bloat. And the lack of granular options makes it a mode that frankly just isn't worth coming back to very often.
I guess you could try it in multiplayer, but apart from that, yeah, I really don't see much reason to play Skirmish much at all.
I think if there was more of a focus on it being a place where you could practice and experiment more, would have given it more reason for being. I'd love to set up specific situations to see how units and factions perform against one another with exact unit and terrain placements, like testing unit types holding off cavalry on a hill, for example. But oh well, we can't have it all.
There's a bit of a joke here on YouTube around creators releasing videos about Total War Rome 2, asking questions like, is Rome 2 good now? Or, it's 2023, is Rome 2 finally good? Well, I've got news for you. Rome 2 was always good. Well, maybe around a year after its release. Or 2.
I get that there are a lot of Total War purists out there who hate what Rome 2 did to the series. The mechanics and systems it implemented that every game after has built itself on. Its reliance on stats and behind-the-scenes number crunching for combat, rather than a simulation of proper tactics, unit morale, and one-on-one combat. I get that, I really, really do, and I agree with probably the majority of it. Some things were better in earlier games. CA have removed and altered features that make Total War games objectively, unequivocally simpler, blander, and with less player freedom. While at the same time relying more and more on fancy presentation and minor additions to take the eyes off the fact that the engine and game mechanics have numerous fundamental issues that remain unaddressed. As players, we should be vocal about what we want, 100%. We can ask for the return of systems that were present in earlier games, voice our disdain for changes that simplify the game, and remove player agency. But that doesn't make the game terrible or irredeemable. Not everyone puts thousands of hours into a game, or even a whole series. Some just want to dip their toe in, spend 20, 30, 40 hours in a campaign every couple of years and call it a day. Perhaps they just love the setting. Maybe they just want to play on easy and paint the map and steamroll through the battles, whatever it may be. In a vacuum, Rome 2 is a good game. It's a great game. But as a product that set the trajectory of Total War still to this day, it's hard not to look back and feel a level of disdain when you're in deep like I am, and as I'm sure a lot of you are as well. It's great when you don't think about it too hard, which I don't think anyone under 50 or so hours will be. That sounds a little rude, but I don't mean it to be. What I mean is that Rome 2 is at its best when you either haven't got a ton of experience with Total War, or are a casual enjoyer of the series, or are there mostly for the vibes, rather than the nitty-gritty details. Because I know there are people out there with hundreds, thousands of hours in this game who love every second of it, and that is great, more power to you. But I think for the majority of people, once they've put serious time into either Rome 2 itself, or other games in the series like Rome 1 or Shogun 2, the cracks here begin to show, and the downsides become harder to ignore. And naturally, I think that applies mostly to the older crowd, the ones who have been with the series for the longest. If you're new to Total War, perhaps you came in with the massive popularity wave of Warhammer, and are looking to experience some of the legacy titles, I can't say you won't have a great time with Rome 2. I know I did until I got really into the weeds with this video, and rediscovered the glory of Shogun 2, and spent the last month playing nothing but this game. I do find myself in a bit of an interesting position though. After this video is done and dusted, I don't think I'll ever come back to Rome 2 again, aside from maybe just refreshing my memory on certain aspects of it if I cover other games in the series. Shogun 2, and by extension Fall of the Samurai, will remain my go-to for historical Total War until a truly better option comes along, if it ever does. And despite Total Warhammer being much more like Rome 2 than Shogun 2, I'm still very excited to dump hours into Warhammer 3 throughout 2024. You see, the issue with Rome 2 nowadays is that unless you're a big fan of the time period, you might as well just play a better Total War game. With Warhammer, the presentation and uniqueness of its setting, characters, and visuals are more than enough to carry it for me, even if the gameplay is very similar to Rome 2. Arguably with the added downsides of massively powerful single unit entities and a further reliance on stats and numbers. But to its credit, the overworld map is much more enjoyable, with a ton of unique mechanics to utilise across its many factions and heroes. A lot of people do recommend DEI and other overhaul mods as solutions to Rome 2's issues, and claim that this is the definitive way to play. And while I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, these just aren't for me. I gave DEI a shot and I really do appreciate what it's trying to do, but it feels far too chaotic, and frankly, I'd just prefer to play a better Total War game rather than graft on complex solutions to one that's just okay. I do get why people enjoy it, and I will be leaving links in the description if you'd like to check it out yourself.
For Total War to succeed and reclaim the glory that it had back in the late 2000s to early 2010s, Creative Assembly need to chill the fuck out.
They need to sit down, take stock, and figure out how they're going to revitalise this franchise and please all aspects of its player base, ranging from old codgers who've been around since Shogun to new blood who came in with Warhammer. A hard task, no doubt, but something I'm sure a talented team of people can achieve if they put their minds to it. Let's be honest here, Total War and Creative Assembly cannot ride on Warhammer forever. They've had 3 successive games that have performed very well, but it was always envisioned as a trilogy. And now that trilogy is nearly spent, and with historical being in the place that it is the perfect time to rebuild and come out with something industry defining as they did with the original Shogun Total War over 20 years ago. Their engine has core problems that need addressing, the gameplay needs revitalizing, and most importantly, the fanbase needs to be convinced that Creative Assembly is the developer to lead the series forward. Total War has never really had a proper competitor in its space, and ironically enough, the biggest roadblock in Total War's continued success is Total War. Creative Assembly have saturated a market where they are the only player, and disillusioned a fanbase that has nowhere else to turn and can only cut the cord entirely and move to greener pastures. What Creative Assembly really needs to do is stop the annual releases. Yes, leave a team with Warhammer 3 to improve sentiment and continue to deliver the content that players expect, ideally at a more reasonable price. But for the rest of the teams, it's time to knuckle down for 2, 3, hell, maybe even 4 years, whatever it takes, to release a Total War game that truly evolves the franchise and builds on what came before. Rather than what we've had for years now, rushing releases that launch in bad states, that lack content, and simplify or remove mechanics that people have enjoyed for years. It's time to look at Total War from top to bottom. Nothing should be out of the question. Mechanics, visuals, settings, gameplay, atmosphere, everything. Right now, the future of Total War is completely up in the air. If the current trajectory is left unchecked, the future for the series is bleak at best and non-existent at worst. The course of the next decade of Total War needs to be charted, and now is the time to do it. The legacy of Rome 2 is a funny one because, well, we're still living it. The post-Rome 2 era has ultimately seen the decline of Total War and left the series in the sorry state that it's in now. There's hope that things will be turned around, but it's impossible to say what's over the horizon. I hope CA can get Warhammer 3 into a great spot, and I hope even more that they can look inward at all of their flaws and put the work into making the best game the series has ever seen. Rome 2 is a perfectly fine game in a vacuum, even a great one, but as a Total War game, it pales in comparison to many of its predecessors, and is hard to be loved by anyone who really lived those previous games. I was watching Reynolds Sanity's old Rome 2 Sane critique video as a reminder on what this game was like on launch, and I'd never watched all the way to the end, and something that he said at the end really clicked with me. It was in his conclusion, and, well, I think I'll just quote him directly to wrap this up, as I couldn't agree more with what he says. There's a link to his full 2-part critique in the description, and I would recommend you watch it if you're interested. It's still surprisingly accurate, given that it's now a decade old. Anyway, here goes. If you've never heard of Total War before, Rome 2 will blow your mind. If you've been playing since Empire, you'll find Rome 2 to be a reasonable progression of the series, but to be substantially worse than Shogun 2. But for those of us who have been playing since the first Shogun, Medieval, or Rome, this game will only disappoint. Thanks so much for watching. I know this one took a while to get done. I think it's been almost 2 months now, so I appreciate you sticking with me, and I really hope you enjoyed the video, especially if you made it to the end. Big thanks to my patrons and YouTube members who keep the lights on around here, especially when I'm away for so long. Thanks to my Cavaliers, Takayo, Bad Ghosts, Sean, Greyspirit4, George, Nedders, John Kaiser, King Thickums, Pavel, Bram, Christian, Dan, Bishop's Arch, Orion, and Das Rufkin, and my Paladins, Johnny, Marika, Age of Cause, Joe, Tank, and Empyrean. Thanks very much, everyone. You know I appreciate you. Calamity Joe asks, why don't we see more naval or air combat in RTS games? That's a good question, probably because it's just hard to do. I'm trying to think of a game that does good air combat or naval combat. Air combat's probably harder because you kind of always need to be interacting with the air unit for it to make sense. Rise of Nations had a pretty good implementation where they just kind of circle and then refuel on their own. Naval combat is probably like Empire Total War, or those kind of Total Wars. When it comes to RTS factions, do you prefer good aligned factions or evil aligned factions? Generally speaking, probably the good ones. I think I'm trying to compare, like, you know, GDI and NOD. I usually lean towards GDI. I like that kind of like badass good side. And Gan Hunter asks, what's your New Year's resolution for this year, 2024? You say you're a bit late, but I'm definitely a bit late, so I'll give you a pass. It's a really tough one. I usually don't do New Year's resolutions. I think for this year, I'm just kind of going to be focusing on making the YouTube videos that I want to make. Not that the resolution has to be specific to YouTube, but I think it's just going to be, yeah, making the YouTube videos I want to make rather than the ones I feel like I have to make. And there will be an update video coming pretty soon about that, so stay tuned. So again, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.